Welcome back to the briefing. There are two numbers that define the moment when a war planned to end quickly through a surgical victory transforms into an existential quagmire collapsing the international order, and those numbers are 20,000 and 1. 20,000 is the maximum ground invasion force the United States can deploy. 1 is the number in millions of active armed forces that Iran has prepared, waiting for that invasion for 35 years. 20,000 against 1 million. A ratio of 1 to 50. And while that apocalyptic numerical asymmetry waits to materialize, an air operation planned for 4 to 6 weeks has just entered week 5 without achieving a single strategic objective. Let that sink in, because this is not about a war where one side needs more time, but eventually achieves objectives through persistence. It is about the moment when the complete fantasy of operational theory collapses, and leadership faces a choice between admitting total failure or escalating toward a ground invasion that mathematics makes impossible to win. An air campaign designed to decapitate the Iranian leadership and produce a popular uprising. Reality produced Mujtaba Khamenei, a figure of vengeance whose family was assassinated, now leading a country with a radicalized population seeking retribution. The expectation was Venezuela, where the population receives invaders as liberators. The result is the complete opposite. Stay with me, because this is not about numbers where 20,000 seems small but manageable, with technological superiority. It is about the convergence of 4 realities that make a ground invasion strategic suicide regardless of advanced capabilities. Reality 1. The USS Boxer and USS Tripoli transport 5,000 to 6,000 Marines, an additional 3,500 deployed, a 10,000 airborne brigade planned, maximum total 20,000. Reality 2. Iran has over 1 million active Sepah forces preparing specifically for this invasion for 35 years. Reality 3, the targets are Karg Island, an oil terminal, and Keshem, 135 kilometers long, 40 wide, with a civilian population of 120,000. Reality 4, the American public only supports sending ground troops by 12%. 20,000 Marines maximum. The USS Boxer and Tripoli each transport approximately 2,500 to 3,000 Marines with equipment, 5,000 to 6,000 already deployed, an additional 3,500 in the region. A 10,000 airborne brigade being mobilized. When you add naval transport capacity and projection logistics, 20,000 is the realistic operational ceiling for a sustainable invasion force. You cannot simply show up with 100,000 troops. Every soldier requires continuous supply, medical evacuation, rotation, logistical support. 20,000 is what military infrastructure can project and sustain simultaneously in a hostile theater. Iran Sepah over 1 million active, preparing for 35 years. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iranian military doctrine was explicitly built anticipating an American or Israeli invasion. 35 years of defensive preparation, massive underground bunkers connected by tunnels crossing mountains, fortified positions in every strategic valley, weapons caches distributed in thousands of locations impossible to map completely, decentralized command networks where destroying central leadership does not paralyze local units, specialized training in asymmetric warfare where every combatant knows how to turn familiar terrain into a lethal advantage against a technologically superior invader. When an adversary spends decades preparing territorial defense specifically against you, building military infrastructure literally under mountains, you are not facing a conventional military. You are facing an entire militarized society waiting for you with geography as a weapon. Karg Island Oil Terminal. Keshem Island 135 kilometers long, 40 kilometers wide, 120,000 civilians. When you plan to invade an island with a civilian population of 120,000, you are not conducting a military operation. You are occupying a densely populated territory where every civilian is a potential insurgent combatant or a humanitarian hostage. Keshem is not an empty aircraft carrier you capture. It is a functioning society with civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, families. Controlling it requires not only defeating military forces, but administering a hostile population indefinitely, 12% American public support. When only 12 out of 100 citizens support a military operation, you have an insurmountable domestic political problem. Democracies cannot sustain wars without public backing. Every American casualty erodes that 12% further. First week you lose 50 soldiers, support drops to 8. Second week you lose 100 more, support collapses to 5. You cannot conduct a military invasion when 90% of the domestic population opposes it. The Venezuela fallacy. The Trump administration believed that by assassinating the Iranian leadership, the population would rise up, receiving American forces as liberating saviors. Exactly like the expectation with Nicolas Maduro. You overthrow a dictator, the people celebrate, democracy emerges spontaneously. But Iran is not Venezuela. Iran is an Islamic republic with 45 years of deeply rooted religious nationalist ideology in every social institution. Assassinating leaders does not produce gratitude. It produces figures of vengeance like Mojtaba Khamenei, whose family was massacred, now leading with a mandate of retribution. The population does not radicalize against the regime. It radicalizes against the invader who killed families. JSOC uranium heist operation. 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, the weight of a normal car, stored in deep bunkers. Operation Midnight Hammer dropped 20,000-pound bunker buster bombs, attempting complete destruction. But command is not confident that the destruction was total. The plan is to physically infiltrate JSOC special forces into the underground facilities to manually destroy or extract 400 kilograms. When you need human operators to verify the destruction of nuclear material because massive bombing does not give you confidence, you admit that air power alone cannot achieve critical objectives. Ground invasion is blackmail. Trump's statements about capturing Karg are not a serious military strategy. They are negotiating leverage for a 15-point peace plan, forcing Iran to negotiate under the threat of invasion. The problem is that Iran knows time works against Trump. Every day Hormuz is closed, the American economy bleeds. Every week the war continues, elections approach. Iran simply waits for the political and economic costs to force an American withdrawal. It doesn't need to win militarily. It only needs to survive until Trump cannot sustain the war politically. Trump in a panic. He sold the war as a quick surgical operation. Week 5 with no strategic victory. He faces elections. He needs a scapegoat. He blames domestic military generals for poor planning. He blames NATO and European allies for not helping. But the reality is that the operational theory was fundamentally flawed from the start. You cannot produce regime change through aerial bombing in an ideologically cohesive society. And now the only option is to escalate to a ground invasion that mathematics makes impossible, or admit complete failure by withdrawing. Netanyahu's Greater Israel agenda. He takes advantage of the American distraction in Iran to pursue unilateral objectives. Intensification in the West Bank. Full-scale invasion of southern Lebanon advancing toward the Litani River, attempting territorial annexation. When your main ally is consumed in a different war, you use the opportunity for your own objectives that the ally would normally restrict. Israel is not helping the American effort against Iran. It is exploiting the distraction for territorial expansion. Russia and China watching from the sidelines, the real winners. American resources melting away in the Middle East means the flow of weapons to Ukraine is weakened. Russia regains operational advantage. China sees a window of opportunity in the Pacific. When a superpower consumes its arsenal and attention in one theater, adversaries in other theaters recalculate possibilities. The world is now clearly divided into spheres of influence: United States, China, Russia. The American unipolar order has ended. The multipolar era has begun. NATO and Europe completely lost confidence. The continent is in terror because no European state, including the United Kingdom, can intercept an Iranian ballistic missile. If Iran decides to hit European capitals in retaliation for allowing US bases, Europe has no defense. The security architecture depended entirely on the American guarantee. That guarantee is now questioned because the United States demonstrated an inability to protect even its own bases in the Gulf from sustained attacks. Bab al-Mandeb, 15% of global trade frozen. Added to Hormuz, it produces a simultaneous strangulation of commercial arteries that will take years to resolve. Inflation, shortages, energy shock are not temporary. They are structural. Global supply chains were built assuming free transit through Suez and Hormuz. When both are closed, you don't reorganize routes immediately. You rebuild the entire commercial architecture, a process that takes years and trillions of dollars. Iranian failed state. A scenario where 20,000 US troops somehow defeat 1 million Iranian forces and capture objectives. The "you broke it, you bought it" rule. Destroyed infrastructure, massive chaos, millions of refugees, a security vacuum. Iran becomes 1990s Afghanistan multiplied by 10, a territory 10 times larger, a population 5 times greater, much more advanced military capabilities distributed into the hands of fragmented groups. It is not a regional problem. It is a generational global terrorism threat, the death of international law. The United States attacking sovereign state after sovereign state without UN Security Council authorization. The international legal system built after World War II is formally dead, a rules-based order replaced by a power-based order. Alliances like NATO lose meaning when the most powerful member unilaterally ignores international law. The world enters an era of the law of the jungle where the powerful do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. Survival of the fittest is not a metaphor. It is the new operational reality of international relations. 20,000 against 1 million. 35 years preparation. Karg and Keshem, 120,000 civilians. 12% support. Venezuela fallacy. Mojtaba vengeance. JSOC, 400 kilograms. Uranium heist. Midnight hammer bunker buster not confident. Invasion blackmail. 15 points. Hormuz time Trump. Panic blame generals. NATO elections. Netanyahu, Greater Israel, West Bank, Lebanon litany. Russia, China, Ukraine weapons, Pacific window. Europe, ballistic terror, nobody intercepts. Bab 15, Hormuz years, inflation shortages. Failed state broke, bought Afghanistan, 90s multiplied. International law dead, UN powerful does weak suffers jungle survival. What happens when 20,000 face 1 million? What happens when week 5 has no strategic objective? What happens when the population doesn't receive liberators? What happens when 400 kilograms requires humans to verify? What happens when invasion is leverage, not strategy? What happens when time works against the invader? What happens when 12% support? What happens when an ally exploits a distraction for expansion? What happens when adversaries see windows in other theaters? What happens when Europe cannot intercept? What happens when strangulation takes years to rebuild? What happens when you broke it, you bought it multiplied by 10? What happens when international law is dead? You are in a war where a maximum force of 20,000 faces 1 million prepared for 35 years, where week 5 surgical fantasy collapsed, where the Venezuela fallacy produced vengeful radicalization, where a 20,000-pound bunker buster gives no confidence, where invasion is blackmail and time works against it, where the public is at 12% and every casualty erodes it further, where panic blames everyone except the original decision, where an opportunistic ally doesn't help but expands, where adversaries recalculate spheres, where a continent is without ballistic defense, where strangulation is structural for years, where a failed state is Afghanistan multiplied into a generational threat, and where the dead legal order has begun the jungle.